What rolled across large parts of the United States wasn't just another winter storm. It was a slow-motion emergency that caught millions off guard. Over several days, an enormous blast of Arctic air stretched from the southern plains into the mid-south, dragging with it a dangerous mix of snow, sleet, and, most destructive of all, freezing rain. This wasn't the kind of storm that announces itself loudly. Ice doesn't fall like snow. It builds, quietly, relentlessly. Hour by hour, a thin glaze turned into a crushing weight. Tree branches bowed, power lines sagged, roads transformed into sheets of glass. In states like Tennessee and Mississippi, ice levels climbed to heights rarely seen in decades. Neighborhoods filled with mature trees became ticking time bombs, and aging power grids were pushed far beyond their limits. The real danger came from the temperature itself. Hovering right around freezing, conditions were just unstable enough to make everything worse. Fast. Emergency officials described it as a cascading disaster. Power lines fell and blocked roads. Fallen trees cut off emergency access. Each failure triggered the next, slowing rescue efforts and leaving entire communities stranded in the cold. What started as a routine weather forecast quickly escalated into a regional crisis, one that exposed how vulnerable many modern communities still are when extreme winter weather hits places that aren't built for it. This storm didn't just freeze highways, it froze daily life. And as it continued to intensify, one truth became impossible to ignore. The most dangerous part of this storm wasn't the snow, it was the ice. Freezing rain coated trees, power lines, and roadways with a thick, glass-like shell, adding thousands of pounds of weight to infrastructure that was never designed to carry it. In parts of Tennessee and northern Mississippi, ice buildup pushed past 1 inch, an amount emergency managers consider a tipping point for widespread structural failure. Branches snapped without warning. Utility poles began to lean, and entire sections of the power grid started to give way. Across suburban neighborhoods and rural backroads, the sound of breaking wood echoed through the darkness as massive trees split apart and slammed into homes, cars, and roadways. First responders reported dozens of blocked routes, cutting off access to entire communities for hours, sometimes longer. In many places, falling trees pulled down live power lines, creating deadly secondary hazards that slowed rescue efforts and made repairs nearly impossible. Utility companies were forced to initiate large-scale shutdowns, acknowledging that repair crews couldn't safely work until the ice load eased. At the peak of the storm, hundreds of thousands of people across the Mid-South were left without electricity, facing overnight temperatures well below freezing. Heating systems failed, communication networks weakened, and families were forced to shelter in place as conditions grew more dangerous by the hour. Transportation quickly became another casualty. Highways, side roads, and bridges turned into invisible sheets of ice, prompting officials to issue urgent travel warnings. State patrols described conditions as essentially undrivable, even for vehicles equipped for winter weather. With falling debris overhead and roads rendered impassable, what should have been a routine drive became a life-or-death risk. And for many, there was simply no way out. What made this storm especially dangerous wasn't just the ice itself, it was how far it reached. Ice storms this intense are rarely spread across such a massive area. This time, millions of people were placed under winter warnings all at once. The disaster wasn't isolated anymore. It was unfolding across an entire region, hour by hour, as power outages multiplied and roads stayed locked in ice. Emergency systems were pushed to the edge. Fire crews, medical teams, and utility workers had to operate in constantly changing and increasingly dangerous conditions. Ice-covered streets slowed response times, while downed power lines and unstable trees made many rescue calls too risky to approach right away. In several counties, officials confirmed that some emergency requests couldn't be reached for hours. Hospitals and critical care facilities switched to backup generators as the power grid became more unstable. Fuel quickly became a serious concern, especially in rural areas where delivery routes were blocked by fallen trees and jackknifed vehicles.
Local governments opened warming centers, but for many residents, getting there simply wasn't possible. For countless families, survival came down to conserving heat, rationing food, and waiting in darkness for the storm to pass. The disruption didn't stop at the state line. Ice at major southern airports triggered a chain reaction of delays and cancellations across the national aviation system, stranding passengers hundreds of miles from where they were supposed to be. Freight movement also slowed or stopped entirely. Key trucking routes were shut down, interrupting deliveries of fuel, groceries, and medical supplies. Meteorologists warned that the storm's structure made it uniquely dangerous. A narrow temperature window, hovering just below freezing, allowed rain to fall as liquid before instantly turning to ice on contact. That setup maximized ice buildup while offering none of the protective insulation snow usually provides. Unlike blizzards, which are visible and expected, freezing rain hides its threat until systems begin to fail. By this point, officials changed their message.
This was no longer about preparation. It was about survival. Public warnings focused on one clear instruction: stay off the roads. Even short trips carried the risk of crashes, electrocution, or becoming trapped with no help in reach. What started as a weather event had become a cascading emergency, one where infrastructure, mobility, and safety were collapsing at the same time under the crushing weight of ice. When daylight finally returned to the hardest-hit areas, the true scale of the damage came into focus. In parts of Tennessee and northern Mississippi, entire neighborhoods looked frozen in place. Streets were buried under broken tree limbs, utility poles lay twisted or snapped, cars were crushed beneath fallen trees. And even after the worst of the storm moved east, the danger didn't stop. The sharp crack of breaking wood continued through the day as ice-loaded branches failed without warning, keeping residents on edge. Utility companies made it clear that power restoration would take days, not hours. In some rural counties, damage surveys showed that entire sections of the electrical system would need to be rebuilt from the ground up, not simply repaired. Repair crews worked around the clock in rotating shifts, cutting through debris to reach substations and transmission lines. Law enforcement secured high-risk zones where unstable trees and live wires made conditions too dangerous for the public. Officials warned that restoring power too quickly could be deadly. Re-energizing damaged lines carried the risk of fires or electrocution if systems weren't fully secured. For residents, the storm forced painful decisions. Some families evacuated to stay with relatives or reach warming shelters. Others stayed behind to protect their homes, livestock, or pets. As power remained out, new risks emerged. Carbon monoxide dangers increased as people turned to generators, fireplaces, and alternative heating sources. Fire departments reported a rise in house fires and medical emergencies linked to unsafe heating practices. Schools and businesses across multiple states announced extended closures as icy conditions lingered. Economic losses climbed rapidly, especially for small businesses unable to operate without electricity or safe access. Insurance companies deployed catastrophe response teams, bracing for thousands of claims tied to fallen trees, frozen pipes, and prolonged outages. And officials stressed one critical point: the danger wasn't over. As ice began to melt, flooding became a concern. Then overnight temperatures dropped again, raising the risk that melting water would refreeze, restarting the cycle of collapse all over again. By this point, the storm was no longer just a weather emergency. It had become a long-term recovery crisis, one that would continue testing infrastructure well after the ice itself was gone. By midweek, state and federal agencies began assembling early damage reports, and the scope was staggering. Winter alerts had stretched across millions of square miles, placing tens of millions of people under some form of snow, ice, or freezing rain warning. Officials described the event as one of the most destructive ice storms to hit the Mid-South in decades, comparable to historic outbreaks that many residents still remember vividly. Meteorologists explained why this storm was so extreme. Warm, moisture-rich air surged north from the Gulf of Mexico, while dense Arctic air remained locked at ground level. That collision created a narrow but persistent freezing rain zone, allowing ice to build hour after hour.
In some areas, ice accumulation exceeded 1 inch, more than enough to overwhelm trees, power systems, and communication towers. Unlike faster-moving winter storms, this system stalled, and with every passing hour, the damage multiplied. State emergency declarations opened the door to federal assistance, including the deployment of National Guard units. Their missions ranged from traffic control and welfare checks to delivering supplies to isolated communities. Utility crews focused first on restoring power to hospitals, water treatment plants, and emergency shelters. Meanwhile, many residential neighborhoods remained untouched, with officials warning that full restoration across all affected counties could take weeks. Economic analysts began tallying the losses. Damage to infrastructure, prolonged business shutdowns, and agricultural impacts quickly added up. Timber losses alone were expected to reach into the billions, threatening long-term stability in forestry-dependent regions. Livestock producers reported injuries and deaths among animals exposed to freezing rain, especially in areas without power or adequate shelter. Beyond the immediate destruction, experts pointed to a deeper concern. Ice storms in regions with typically mild winters pose a unique and growing risk because the infrastructure simply isn't built to withstand prolonged freezing conditions, and this storm made that vulnerability impossible to ignore. As climate patterns grow more unpredictable, events once considered rare are happening more often, placing new strain on systems built for a very different era. What unfolded here wasn't just a weather disaster, it was a stress test, and it revealed how quickly modern life can break down when ice becomes the dominant force. As temperatures stayed locked below freezing, the human impact of the storm became impossible to ignore. Thousands of residents spent days without heat, electricity, or reliable access to food and clean water. Emergency shelters filled quickly, especially in rural counties where power restoration was expected to take the longest. Elderly residents and people with medical needs were among the most vulnerable. Prolonged outages created life-threatening conditions. Emergency responders conducted door-to-door welfare checks in hazardous environments, navigating ice-covered streets and unstable terrain. Hospitals continued operating on backup generators, while ambulance crews were forced to maneuver through roads cluttered with fallen trees and downed power lines. In some areas, emergency response times doubled as crews had to clear debris before they could even reach a call for help. Fire officials warned that the danger didn't end when the ice stopped falling. Weakened trees, unstable structures, and live electrical lines remained serious threats long after the precipitation moved out. Utility providers cautioned that power restoration would be slow and uneven. The ice hadn't just snapped lines, it damaged transmission towers and substations that required specialized repairs. Crews from multiple states were brought in to help, but progress remained limited. Blocked roads, unstable infrastructure, and ongoing safety risks continued to slow recovery efforts. And even as the ice began to fade, the crisis it created was far from over. Officials urged patience while strongly warning against unsafe heating methods after early reports linked generators, space heaters, and open flames to carbon monoxide poisonings and house fires. As formal response systems stretched thin, community support became a lifeline. Neighbors shared generators, food, and warm shelter. Volunteer groups organized warming centers and delivered supplies to isolated households. Faith-based organizations and local nonprofits stepped in where official help couldn't reach right away. Experts say this storm points to a bigger shift. As extreme winter events push into regions not accustomed to prolonged ice, preparedness strategies must evolve. Strengthening infrastructure, managing vegetation near power lines, and improving emergency planning are no longer optional, they're essential. The ice will eventually melt, but the impact of this storm will last far longer. As temperatures slowly rise, the full aftermath is coming into focus. What began as a winter weather system turned into a multi-state emergency, exposing fragile infrastructure, the limits of readiness, and the human cost of extreme cold across Tennessee, Mississippi, and surrounding states. Cleanup efforts are only just getting started. Debris removal, power restoration, and rebuilding are expected to continue for weeks. Officials warn that dangers remain. Weakened trees can still fall without warning. Damaged power lines continue to pose deadly risks, and icy patches persist on shaded roads and rural routes. Emergency agencies are urging residents to remain cautious, limit travel, and follow official guidance as recovery operations move forward. Meteorologists and climate scientists stress that this storm is not a one-time anomaly. Ice storms of this scale are becoming more common in areas historically unprepared for extended freezing conditions. As weather patterns grow more volatile, the question is no longer if storms like this will return, but when. For those affected, the storm leaves behind more than broken trees and power lines. It leaves lessons about readiness, resilience, and the importance of taking warnings seriously when nature sends clear signals. The sounds of cracking trees and collapsing power lines will fade, but the memory of how quickly normal life unraveled will endure. If you want to stay informed about major weather events, disaster impacts, and the science behind extreme conditions, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring critical information to more people. Stay alert, stay prepared, and most importantly, stay safe.